Was this a career path you were always interested in?
Well, I was always going to be an artist. As far back as I can remember, I always drew and painted, and I always wanted to. That's the only thing I ever thought of being. It just came so naturally to me, and I was one of those kids that constantly filled the empty margins on his test page with drawings and the book covers and things like that. I was constantly drawing in class. And then in sixth grade, I had a teacher named Mrs. K. And there were two things about Mrs. K. First, she was my first teacher who I thought was pretty. I just had a crush on her. She was right out of college, and we were her first class that she ever taught. And she was the first teacher who didn't yell at me for drawing in class. She went out of her way with finding ways to incorporate me creating artwork into the curriculum. For instance, one time she passed out Swiss Family Robinson to the entire class to read, and they were supposed to write a book report about it. And she called me up to her desk and she said, "I don't want you to write a book report. I want you to draw one picture for every chapter." And was genius because A, I felt special. B, I got to do what I love to do. And she knew that I would have to read the book to know what to draw. So she was a genius. And then I had to go down to our school librarian, Mrs. Gross, and ask her to help me find other books so that I could see what kind of clothes they wore and what the ships looked like and all kinds of things like that. So without even realizing it, I was starting to do research. And it took me another 20 years, probably. I was already working as a professional illustrator when I realized that she was my first art director. And that was my first illustration job. All my favorite books from when I was a child were, beautifully illustrated. And so it was like it was always waiting there for me. And I just had to discover it. That's all.
I come from a family of writers, or I should say a publishing family, mostly in newspapers and magazines, but every generation would do something different. My grandfather was the Sunday editor of the New York Times for many, many years. My mother and father were both journalists and editors for major magazines, and my father for the New York Times. So, often what happens is you grow up around the dinner table, and that's the discussion. And so obviously in a family like that, words were very important. Everyone was editing everybody else, so you become a good editor almost by default.
Honestly, I kind of fell into it. One of my teachers in college had done some work for Capstone. So one day he had like a presentation about like just what it was like to write for them. And he ended up going on to get a job there as an editor. And they needed an intern around the same time that I graduated. So he recommended me and I got the job, and it was like a perfect, like right place, right time situation.
My dad, he's still here. He's an artist. He was an artist. He was a draftsman, an art director, a studio manager. And he was my, major influence in becoming an artist. Because as I said, I had no art education in elementary school. My elementary school art classes consisted of the teacher doing a really bad drawing of Charlie Brown on the blackboard and then telling us to copy it. So if that's learning art, then I guess I did have art classes, but that was about it. No, we had no art history, no anything. When I went to high school, I chose a high school I went to because of their art and music program. The year that I got in, they slashed the budget, and guess what went? You're correct, art and music. Back then, I started just drawing for myself. I would read books on anatomy. I geeked out on everything. I tell people, I was a geek. And then, of course, learning about other artists, N.C. Wyeth. I would say that my biggest influence in terms of illustration, N.C. Wyeth. And then the entire Wyeth family in terms of what I do with my fine art. But of course, Norman Rockwell and all the golden age illustrators, Howard Pyle. I was lucky enough to visit Howard Pyle's studio a while back, which is still standing, and stand on the spot where he gave his lectures. So if you're an illustrator, it's like, you're in, a holy place where the father of American illustration once taught the best students ever. So yeah, so all those things come into what influenced me to become an artist, starting with my dad and then the great illustrators that followed.
In retrospect, looking back, I have kind of realized that I did always, not always, but I did write from a young age, kind of for my own sake. I kept a diary as a kid and as a teenager, and I found one recently from when I was maybe 12, and I had documented all of the current events of the day, which I didn't even remember doing, but I guess I had an interest in sort of preserving history and explaining. I don't know who I ever thought would read this, because nobody has, it's only me, but I guess I did feel like that was an important thing to do. And then in high school, I sort of had a hobby of writing stories, I would write like sort of children's stories and illustrate them, and maybe show them to a friend or two. I never thought of it as something I would do for my job. I don't think I knew anybody who did that. I didn't know science journalists. I didn't know authors that I can remember, or I just didn't, because I thought of myself as a science person, I didn't think that that was something I would or could ever do for my job. So it wasn't until later, when I sort of realized that I wanted to do this and that I could do this, that I kind of could look back and realize, oh, I did like writing. I just I hadn't thought about it as something I would do for my job. And the other thing I realized too is that I always loved reading and magazines. And I did get science magazines as a kid. And, even as I was thinking I would be a scientist, I loved just going to the newsstand and flipping through magazines. I often would pick up science magazines. And I just loved the feeling of flipping through them and reading the stories, and everything about it seemed kind of magical to me. And it's funny now that I reflect on it, that I never occurred to me. I mean, it did eventually, but for a long time it didn't. I never thought, well, I could do this. I could help make this. I just thought, oh, this is something I like to do in my free time, is read these and kind of revel in them. So it was fun when I finally started writing for magazines, and seeing my name and my stories that I wrote in those magazines that I'd always loved was just a really fun and magical and exciting experience for me, especially in the beginning.